So now I would like to invite Robin Moran, who will coordinate and moderate the next panel. Martha, Elliot, Pamela, Danielle, and this panel is going to be about the future, considering what we've already discussed.
Let's see. Só segundo.
Yeah, Robin just sent me a message. She needs a minute.
Okay. Okay. But anyway, I think we have had fantastic discussion. Elliot, if you want to start up with your comments from what you have seen so far, and actually touching bases also on what Robin just sent us as key points for today. So just to gain time.
Sure. I just jotted down a few notes of some high points I thought are worth considering. First of all, how important it is to keep up with variants, especially in the COVID world, but also for any infectious disease. If there are variants, then we need to know the impact on diagnostics. So we hear a lot in the media about concern about whether a vaccine is going to be, the effectiveness of a vaccine is going to be affected by the mutation, but you hear nothing about whether the mutation is going to affect the ability to detect the virus. So infected people may go undetected. I think, as I mentioned yesterday, there were 26 FDA authorized tests, which had elements of them that did not detect the virus. So I want to advocate for that. I also want to advocate for risk-based assessments, especially when it comes to acceptable performance, because it's counterproductive, I think, to expect near perfect performance if that's actually not needed. And so there needs to be some thought that goes into what is considered acceptable sensitivity and specificity. Just a couple more things. I think we also need to take into account manufacturers' ability to manufacture the test. And so it's not running out, the tests will be available when they're actually needed. And also the cost, because sometimes the cost can be exorbitant and not realistic for people to purchase because of that. And also one last thing, I just wanted to advocate also for studies that will demonstrate the utility of antibody tests. What does an antibody test result actually mean? And not have people use those tests inappropriately to determine if they need to be vaccinated or need to quarantine and so on and so forth. So I'm sorry, I'll stop there and let others join in the conversation.
Oh, hi. So it's Robin. So can everyone hear me?
Yes, yes. Welcome, Robin. Please.
Sorry, Carlos. I had the wrong link, but anyway, thank you.
You're welcome. We just started, so yes. I asked Elliot just to give a little bit of summary of the key points that we had discussed and his view on the future. But if you want to take the lead, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's really great to be here, and we've heard some fantastic talks over the last few days. And I guess one thing I think that has been a common theme is that there is a need that business as usual can never be what it was. Getting a product that makes a difference to many lives. We cannot do it the way we did in the past. It's too slow. The pandemic has taught us that. So, and I think when we listened to Rosanna's speech yesterday, she was really pushing the fact that we can't have parallel processes and they must more be, can't have sequential processes. They must be in parallel. So how are we going to make this all happen? And so I wanted today to ask the panel, and we have a fantastic panel with us today, just what they would be doing if we were asked to write a template or a blueprint for how to introduce IVDs into the market and be effective using the lessons we've learned from COVID. So I think it's actually really important. It's not just for COVID self-tests, it's also for HPV, for chlamydia, gono. But at the moment, I have a real concern. So since my time at WHO, I've been working mainly on EU regulations. And many of you will be aware that the EU the regulations are changing. Now, the bar of quality has highly increased. Sorry, I just lost my earpiece. And there's actually a great risk that many products will no longer be available on the market. I know of many big manufacturers who are reducing the number of products they are bringing to market. So we are going to be faced with supply shortages, without doubt. So this scenario of having some sort of template or blueprint on how we should do business now, the new business as usual, is really vital. And I guess the first thing that, one of the things that I think FIND has done an amazing job in, and others too, has been teaching politicians, teaching everyday people just what the diagnostic use case is. And I think there was a poor understanding. We saw at the beginning of the pandemic that tests were just, any test was used in any way. And we realized that not all tests can fill all purposes. And so, Marta, do you want to talk a little bit to us about how important it is to understand the diagnostic use case when you're thinking of introducing a test?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe we can put an example, as you were referring to with the pandemic, right? Separating what's technically possible versus what the use case for that technology is very important. Early on in the pandemic, the first tests obviously that came to market were molecular, and they had a clear use case for diagnosis. But then very soon thereafter, we had antibody tests in the market, right? So tests that were able to look at the immune response. And then manufacturers jumped on making these tests, and countries jumped into making use of these tests, right? And we were using serologic tests that were looking at the immune response for diagnosis. And it was made very clear that that was not the best use case, right? So antibody tests are not detecting active infection early on, but rather they become positives over time. So not the best use case for those tests. So understanding what each test is useful for is critical, both to implement it, but also to design the studies, right? When we think about regulatory and others, to design the studies that allow us to prove that the performance of that test is adequate for that clinical use. Then over time, we realized we phased out antibody tests as a diagnostic test, and we placed them where they need to be, which is in seroprevalence studies and for others, and obviously in the context of vaccines. And then the antigen test came, which proved to have a better use case. So I think it's a good example of how it is very important that we define what each test is going to be used for. And even within this example of the antigen test for COVID, then we can talk about, are we talking about contact tracing? Are we talking about diagnosis of a symptomatic individual, or are we talking about a screening populations of asymptomatic individuals? And each one of those use cases will require different studies. It will also require different designs from the product in terms of usability, but in terms of performance. So it's a very different regulatory pathway initially, first different development pathway, second different regulatory pathway, and third different implementation and policy development for each one of those. So we need to be very clear upfront on what each use case for a given test will look like.
Thank you. I totally agree with you. Daniela, you've had experience working in the ministries of health. I'm just wondering if you can give me any thoughts on how useful target product profiles might be, not only for developers, but maybe also for the ministries of health. I'm not sure how familiar you are with using them, but we've seen WHO have produced a number for COVID, and MHRA, the UK, regulated it too. Have you any thoughts on this matter?
I haven't been working specifically with COVID, but certainly the lessons learned, they contribute a lot for other diseases. Within the context that the three of you gave us, and along with our discussions, it is important to highlight that we should approach not only the pre-analytical phase or the analytical phase or just the post-analytical phase, which includes the insertion of these materials in the market, but we cannot miss the diagnosis opportunity, what we could call the pre-analytical stage. Many times patients, they don't know that they need to have, they cannot eat before the test, or they don't know that they should provide do a certain hygiene process before doing the collection. So what happens? They arrive at the health clinic, they receive that information, and they go back home, and we're not certain that they will come back. So we miss an opportunity with that. Thinking about the post-analytical stage, in my understanding, when we include new technologies in the public health system or in the different global health systems, we also should consider this stage as a post-analytical stage. What can citizens understand from the result from the test? And having a message like this: listen, you should see your doctor right away, or stay home until you can schedule an appointment with your doctor. Stay self-isolated. Basically having these messages that users and citizens can be a part of, so they can be included in the process. So yes, I do believe that we also need to study this journey, not only the patient's journey, but the journey that different health managers go through in this process of acquiring and distributing these products. I think this is what I had to say. Pamela, you also work in the ministry. Would you like to add any comments? Hi. Certainly, I agree with what you said, Daniela. We still have a lot to learn. We have learned a lot from COVID, and I'm sure we will be able to improve the work we do from now on. But regarding this movement that WHO does, that is becoming stronger with the TPPs, or the target product profiles, it is very interesting because people don't know exactly what is the best sensibility or the best specificity, or what is expected from the collection time, how long after they should come back, what is the necessary infrastructure. So once experts gather and define them that together, that can help us guide the industry and researchers that invest on researchers that focus on public health needs. And with that, we can have a much more favorable result that leads to a quality access to the whole of the population, which is something that has been reinforced many times during the event.
Thank you very much. Now, Rosanna also said yesterday that it was really important when we're gathering evidence and for policy development that we take account of the breadth of stakeholders that are available to make timely policy development. And she included groups like civil society, the departments of education, trade and finance. And Segundo, I wonder if you would like to give me your thoughts on how important this is, that we consider that that it's not just about talking to medical scientists, which many of us in the room probably are, but expanding when we're thinking of policy development having an expanded stakeholder group. Segundo, would you like to add any thoughts to this?
Sure, Robin, thank you. Sí, en realidad hay varias cosas acá y me gustaría un poco dibujar.
I could say a lot about this. And first, I would like to give you a broader perspective, because during the COVID pandemic, we were able to see some strengths, some specificity, but especially in terms of diagnosis, we must remember that we had gone through other pandemics before that were not solved just based on diagnosis because of real struggles. We have Hansen's disease, we saw tuberculosis. These are important problems regarding the development of guidelines. HIV is an epidemic that has been around for 40 years. So if we can develop different guidelines in order to develop these self-tests. We're starting this implementation, but it's not something that is fully implemented in all countries. In the countries where this process has already started, there has been some resistance that we need to fight against, and this is what we need to work on the coming years. So COVID highlighted some weaknesses that should be considered. In this setting, we face a constant change, even though the FDA is a global reference for the approval of in vitro diagnosis products. There's a huge delay associated to other diagnosis technologies. And we do have a complicated scenario for the next months. And probably the same thing is happening in Brazil, Peru, and the European Union. They're changing their regulations. In some situations, we have more harmony, complicated situations. In that sense, inside academia, inside the communities, there is a need to have more transparency in the guidelines with the participation from the authorities from the Ministry of Health, from academia as well, to incorporate not more tests and to spread the technology, because it's not just a matter of having the test. It is important for the population and for health professionals to know that tests are available. And what can users do? What they should do once they get the result.
Thank you. That's really great input. Now, Carlos, I'm going to ask you a question. You know, as tests are introduced, of course, we need a lot of evidence quickly on how to do that. And we have a lot of new technologies that can help accelerate access to that intelligence, be it the results of usability studies, be it the results of surveys of relevant patient groups or whatever. Would you like to tell us a little bit about how you think we can maximize these new technologies for intelligence gathering, and some of your thoughts on how they may be used to actually accelerate this development cycle, or at least the cycle from introduction to effective rollout of a program?
Excelente pergunta, Robin.
That is an excellent question, Robin. And what we see inside the world of diagnosis is actually a need to include a number of different stakeholders that are working together to improve access to therapy, something that can only be done after the diagnosis. And here I'm talking about the right diagnosis done at the right time for the right person by the right people. That is only possible through collaboration. The pandemic has shown that medical societies, the industry, the civil society, together, they can create this information. The example from COVID was the fact that in Brazil, that thanks to the support from the Clinical Pathology Society and others, we created a group that included 13 private and public labs that conducted this huge evaluation on all the new tests, new technologies, tests that were unknown, and many times tests from unknown manufacturers. So this extra help that came from the civil society was essential. It was essential in supporting Anvisa in their decision to create an emergency approval, so that they were able to provide information for our health surveillance agency, including information of post-market surveillance for different actions that were needed. That's the first thing. The second thing, we have performance data for buyers, public and private. These data were good for us to determine what that product was good for. And that also served as additional support to manufacturers and importers that could actually improve their own production, bringing a better lot or a better batch right away. Of course, that worked in a coordinated way, so we could really show the value of diagnosis for the whole of the population. We have never talked so much about the importance and the value of diagnosis as we do right now. Here in Brazil, you can stop at a bus station and ask, what is a PCR test? They might not give you all the technical details, but they know why you should use a PCR test and how it's done. This was unimaginable some years ago. So what we see is that it is essential to have a collaborative effort. The project that is being led by FIND is amazing, but it is only possible because we have the help and the support of different stakeholders. What we are doing in ACT-AID for vaccines, for drugs, and for diagnosis, it's also amazing. This is a group of stakeholders from different areas, from different regions with different styles, and they're all working together to improve access. And let's remember that in the future, what will be valid for COVID could be applied for other diseases. And we're talking about this concept of testing and treating. Testing, so we can use the most effective drug that has a scientific evidence and we know that will work. So we are going through a major revolution. The life cycle of diagnosis that usually lasts 3 to 4 years, and it's highly dependent on the collaborative effort. And I mean research, development, innovation, regulation, access, and monitoring of the market. This cycle usually lasts 3 to 4 years. Now, with information technology, with 4.0 health, and with the collaboration of different stakeholders, we can bring innovative technology to the market much faster without forgetting of removing those technologies that are obsolete now, because we do not have an unlimited amount of resources, but we do have room to improve this idea of providing better health to the whole of the population. So I think that overall, Robin, this is it. It's a great advancement, but that was only possible because of the collaboration of all.
Absolutely. And I don't know if I'm just going to open the floor here. If anyone, I'm going to ask a question that you may not have thought of, but this is something that I've found definitely a problem with the pandemic. And that is when all the resources in government are so stretched. One thing we've been finding is you may make a little progress in progressing a policy or the development of a policy or an agreement on regulation. And then you find that because during the pandemic, as everyone's doing so many jobs, you're talking to a different person every day in government, and the information doesn't necessarily get handed on. And sometimes some great progress that has been made stops because there's no access to anyone in the government. Now, this is a real case scenario, because the other day I was invited to a meeting by a government to help consider by a regulator actually, how to help bring in self-testing for COVID. And they said they'd tried to contact their Ministry of Health. All the usual people they contacted weren't there anymore, were in different roles. And so no one who was there knew anything about it. How do you think we can advocate to keep this? Everyone is aware of the importance of IVDs, diagnostics at the moment, but how can we keep this, the importance of our trade in the minds of public servants who are already busy? How do you think we can get this continuum? Because obviously we can do things upstream with to incentivize manufacturers. We can get donors to help with that. We can even get stakeholder groups, the civil society engaged. But sometimes government can unwittingly be the block. Has anyone got any thoughts on this? Because I do know this is a major problem in a few jurisdictions at the moment.
Yeah. If I may reply to your question, we are running out of time, so I'll try to summarize. But the key points here, I think, is really to engage all different stakeholders together in a way that we are doing right now here. So this event is going to bring many results. Not only the presentations that you have seen, but every moderator is going to be invited to write or an article or a summary that we can use. Every presentation, roundtable discussion is going to be available on the internet. It's going to generate byproducts. This is a kind of, let's say, steps that we make and are going to become public. So they can be valid and use it anywhere. Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Guatemala, in anywhere. So these are very, very good proofs of what we can accomplish together, from a work like Evandro Chagas that Daniela showed, a work that Dudi Levy showed with HPV, and so many excellent examples. This is something that governments do know, but they don't pay attention. But we are going to go there and knock at their doors and show, look, this is what we, citizens of a country, have accomplished. It's a fantastic material, let's use. The same applies for regulations, for regulators, for different entities. So it's to show what the world is producing. It's a fantastic work, and we are all proud to be a collective part in this fantastic job that has been done. So in a summary, I believe so. And I don't know if anyone wants to also add any remark, please feel free. And then I ask to go for the closing part.
So we're all part of an education campaign. And I think we must we're all advocates, and we must remember we all have a voice in this, I guess, is what you're saying, Carlos, and to keep our voice loud and clear.
Yeah, we all are stakeholders at the end.
Só gostaria de adicionar também à fala de todos, é que a gente que trabalha.
I would also like to add that we that work in diagnosis, that advocate for diagnosis, the word is we have to be tireless. All discussions, every moment that we have the opportunity to reinforce the importance of diagnosis, we have to tell how important it is, because right now during the COVID pandemic, the world is talking about vaccines, but we have to keep talking about the importance of diagnostic tests. So people would say, oh, here she comes talking about diagnostics again, but really, this is what we do. This is the job that all of us professionals are doing, and we all believe in that, and we have to reinforce the issue of diagnostics to promote access. And just like Carlos mentioned, to test and treat, and not only treat.
Elliot, would you like some, and Daniela, two quick final words from the two of you?
Então, eu achei muito interessante as suas considerações.
Yes, I found your considerations, your remarks very interesting. And I'm thinking about your provocation and just, thinking and talking at the same time. This may not be a very mature thought, but we have to use this force generated by different organizations so that we might be able to maybe structure some governance guidelines that we could propose to the authorities of a country, for example, because then we would have a governance guidelines, some standards that whether governments and managers are changing, the intention is not changed. The policies for public health are not changed. So I really am sharing an idea that might be, mature to see if it really works, and it might become a proposal. But I really do believe that since we have agents here that are creating deadlines, protocols, and other documents, maybe this exercise, this quote unquote homework, could be done by us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great. Elliot?
One more thought from me, and that is these workshops are unique, and that is at once incredibly important and incredibly productive, and at the same time it's a bit troubling, because we need more of these. We need people to bring people together, as Carlos and Rosanna and others have done, to workshops like this, to move the importance of diagnostics forward. So I would only hope that this should serve as this will serve as a model, or I think it has, but I would like to see more of them as a model for moving ahead and advocating for diagnostics. So thanks very much for doing this.
And Marta, I realized I haven't given you a last word.
No worries at all. I mean, just to comment that I think, as you said, this pandemic has created a momentum that we need to keep up. So not to reiterate on what everybody's doing, I would say there is some hope from the government and the politics side. Both from the G7 with the UK presidency, there is a huge momentum with the 100 days mission, right there. This effort to identify what can we do better for the next pandemic. And also you mentioned the ACT Accelerator, right? The Access to COVID Tools Accelerator. There is now a call to continue that work throughout the next years to prepare for the next. Now, this is still very focused on pandemics or on outbreak pathogens, I should call them. And I think part of the effort that we need to make is to bring that same attention to the need for diagnostics to all of the other diseases that are endemic to our regions and that are very much prevalent. But just like everybody else, I'm optimistic that we can use this momentum if we just keep working together.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, one and all. And Carlos, sorry we went over time, but I think it's been a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Robin, I really appreciate your effort to be here with us virtually, but it was fantastic as to all of you. I think we had great momentum. We are creating a great momentum, as Marta said, after so many different talks and sharing experiences. So thanks a lot. And now I will turn to our last part of the event, calling back Rosanna to say some final remarks and also show a little bit of the options for accelerating access to diagnostic. Rosanna, it's up to you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And I'd like to take this opportunity to continue the conversation about this unique opportunity to advocate for diagnostics. I think I want to give two examples. One is that Dave Persing from Cepheid, whom many of you may know, he said to me that it's really the first time he has heard in the public that they know the difference between CPR and PCR. And that's a great achievement in terms of, what the pandemic has brought in terms of the profile of diagnostics. And then the other one is when I was talking to Jeremy Farah, who was supporting our work on accelerating access. I said, oh, it's going to be so difficult because, diagnostics is underfunded, undervalued, and it's like the neglected stepchild that no one wants to pay any attention to. And he said, no, don't say that. Say that diagnostics is like the Cinderella of global health. And so now we are at the moment when Cinderella has been invited to the ball. So we really need to make the best of this opportunity. So with that, I'd like to get down to the business of looking at options for acceleration. So I just like to share my slides and show you what progress we've made in terms of at the beginning, when we were talking with the different regions about options for accelerating access. We were only talking about having expedited regulatory review mechanisms such as the EUA or EUL. We're talking about regulatory reliance, convergence, harmonization, and building on existing initiatives, either in medicine or vaccines or small groups already clustered in terms of their ability to review dossiers. But there is also within the policy consultations, the need for health technology assessment to be more commonly used in a number of countries, so that we have a means for policymakers to look at what should be done when it's a changing world in terms of the use of diagnostics in non-healthcare settings. And also for vaccine pre-screening, as you heard today, for the dengue vaccine rollout. And then I also thought that maybe we could have these forums more often, just to give regulators and policymakers updates on new technologies, so that they're not just hit with a dossier to decide what to do, but they are not very familiar with the technology to know what its advantages are and what its limitations are. And then, we propose that maybe the groups could come up with other options. And we also show that the WHO has now published a chart on how countries, the NRAs, the national regulatory authorities, could start looking at reliance and starting with just independent decisions to leveraging the work of others or work sharing, and then having a bridge pathways using reliance, and then have a fully fledged reliance mechanism, and or coming up to unilateral or mutual recognition. So this was how months ago we started to talk with the different focal points in different regions about these options. Now, what happened in Cameroon was that after 2 days of looking at all these issues, they came up with 12 points for moving forward, and it remains for them to make priorities on which points to make forward. But I just like to, for the purpose of this discussion, describe them in groups rather than just 12 points. I think for me, the number 12, saving lives, should be the first priority. That is really important, because after all, that's why we want to have increased access. That's why we want to have accelerated access. The most urgent is to save lives, but of course, it's also to increase health service delivery for people who are not having access at the moment. But that is one thing that they wanted to keep as a very important guiding principle on how to move forward. And then the second is number 2 and number 9, which is that in spite of the fact we want to increase access, we want to accelerate access, there should be no compromise on data and evidence, and no compromise on quality, which I totally agree with. But I think the no compromise on data and evidence in a pandemic, it could be interpreted as more flexible accumulation of data and evidence, just like we are doing with the vaccines at the moment. And then number 7 and number 8 is sharing. Sharing is so important. Sharing of results, sharing of protocols, sharing of best practice. And this is within the African region. And then finally, all the other parts are related to the status of regulatory reviews on the African continent. And so everybody agreed that there should be an Africa regulatory authority or authorities, but with a regional approach, taking into account cultural differences, language differences between different subregions of Africa. And they agree that a regulatory framework for in vitro diagnostics must be developed and not have it just always hidden inside medical devices, which for non-IVD type medical devices, the regulatory framework could be different. And so this having a IVD regulatory framework would allow us to make progress a lot easier and with a more clear vision. And then the regulators, they feel they need to be more flexible to take into account the opinion of policymakers as to the risks and benefits. And they also ask for more capacity building for regulators to know all these advances that have been happening and the changing environment, health environment, as you discussed at this meeting, the new technology, but also a new health environment. How do we keep changing and have a culture of continuous learning? Now, the only part that I haven't touched on is the drugstore offer competition. Now, this is something to explore. And I think in your region, you've done a great job of pharmacies working together with the ministries of health, with everybody else to offer services. Whereas in Africa, what they saw was that drugstores were just trying to make money by offering medicines for COVID during the pandemic and making a lot of money, but with no responsibility, no accountability for what they sell and why they were selling these packages of medicines, especially antibiotics for families and not only for individuals. So I think that's something to be resolved in their region. So I'm pleased to show you that actually the actual regional consultation in Africa that happened last week came up with much richer options for moving forward than we originally anticipated. And so now within this region, from what I've heard the last 2 days, there are, you have different options and different priorities, and you already have quite a lot of really important institutions that could help with this process. The USAID representative talked about the MDRC, the Americans National Standards Institute, NC, and there's Conitech, there's all kinds of societies, institutions that already have infrastructure that could help with this process. And so we need all of us now just to be champions and to work with these organizations that are set up and not to duplicate what others have been doing, but also just work together to make the process more efficient. And we're all trying to champion this, but let's do it in a collective way. And I really thank all of you for all the really good and important presentations on the status of what it is like for in vitro diagnostics on this continent. And thank you to Carlos for organizing this amazing conference. Thank you. Over to you,
Excelente.
Carlos.
Obrigado, Rosana. Pra gente...
Thank you, Rosana. And I can speak on behalf of everyone here. It's always a pleasure to work with you throughout these 11, 12 years, I think. I have learned constantly, and I believe we have also developed a friendship. For me, this is very important, but for all of us Brazilians, we recognize the great effort that you have made and the attention that you dedicate to our region. Without a doubt, this is a seed that was planted many years ago and that today is already generating visible results in improving our regulatory system and improving our access. This international workshop started after a suggestion made by Rosana Peeling in an event called ACDX, Advanced Course on Diagnosis. And every year we host one edition. And this is the result of a global effort to promote access to diagnosis and to the best treatment available. And we learn a lot, especially through the collaboration of so many people that are able to truly make a difference. So now I would like to conclude and thank everyone who have been with us here face-to-face, helping us. I'd like to thank the technical team. And I would like to thank all of you who have invested precious time from your day. This has been a great effort and we all need to participate on it. It's very easy to wait something that is ready and developed by the government, but that's not the case. We have the responsibility and we have to take that role and leave a legacy for the future generations through this joint effort. So this is what I had to say. This is the end of our workshop and our seminar. Thank you very much. I wish you all a great day and be certain we will have a lot of work to do in